All right, everybody, today we are taking a look at factoring. And the first part of factoring that we need to look at when we talk about factoring these trinomials that we work with is to work with the X game. So the first part of your assignment today is the level 3 X game. So as hard as they get, here we go. Let's try the first one. So first we have negative 100 is the number we're trying to multiply. So it goes on top. And 15 is the number we're trying to add to get. So the first step to trying to solve these is to write out all of our factors. So we would have 1 and 100, 2 and 50. So remember, we want the factors of 100. We don't care about the negative right now. We're just listing the two things that multiply to give me 100. 3 doesn't work. 4 and 25. 5 and 20. 6 doesn't work. 7 doesn't work. 8 doesn't work, 9 doesn't work, but 10 and 10 does work. Now I know I've reached all of my factors because I've hit 10 and 10 on both sides of here. If I were to try and continue going, I would just hit 20 and go back up the ladder this way. So to know which ones I'm going to pick, I need them to add to give me 15. Well, I know 10 and 10 can't give me 15. And I know that 1 and 100, 2 and 50, those definitely don't get me 15. These two are my closest options. Now the important thing to note is that I do have a negative 100. So when I multiply two numbers, I know that one of these has to be negative. So I'm going to put a negative on the left. So I need it to multiply to give me a negative 100. So we have one negative factor, or factor on the left is going to be negative, and the one on the right here is going to be positive. However, when I add the two numbers together, I get a positive number. So that tells me that I need these two to combine by subtraction to give me a positive 15. Well, 4 minus 25 would be a negative 21, or 25 minus 4 would be a positive 21. So I know that one can't work. 5 minus 20 would give me a negative 15. But remember, I don't want negative, I want positive. So let's try the other way. 5 minus 20 would give me that positive 15. So 5 is going to be the negative, 20 is the positive. My two factors are negative 5 and 20. So we found our two factors. We can try out another example here by clicking on to the next one. All right, so again here, moving on to our second option. What happens when I want to multiply to get negative 14 and add together to get a negative 5? Well, again, the first thing I want to do is start listing the things that multiply together to give me 14. And right now I don't care that it's negative. I know that I have 1 and 14, 2 and 7, 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, 5, 6, back up to 7. The only factors here are 1 and 14 and 2 and 7. So now I need to take into account this negative here because I need to know if I'm going to multiply to get a negative number. That means that only one of my factors is going to be negative. So I'm going to make it the one on the left. Doesn't matter where you put it. But now I need my factors to add together to give me a negative 5. Since the number is negative when I add them together, that tells me that the bigger parts of my factor need to be the negatives. So let's go ahead and say this is negative 7 and negative 14. And what happens when I... All right, so let's take a look at what happens when I add these together. So if I have 1 plus negative 14, that would give me a negative 13. Well, we know that doesn't work. But if I take 2 plus a negative 7, that would give me a negative 5. So I know that I'm going to have a negative 7 and a positive 2 because I add up to get what I needed. And if I multiply them together, I would get negative 14. So now that we've practiced a little bit with how to factor for the X game, now we can apply this skill to factoring our trinomials. All right, so we're going to continue by taking that method of the x factor and actually trying to factor out our quadratic equations. Remember, a quadratic is something that has a squared as its highest degree and has 3 terms in it to make it a trinomial. So we want to use this example here first of x squared plus 3x minus 10 and factor it. And we're going to follow these 4 steps here. The first step is to make sure that the quadratic equation can be set to 0. Well, this one already can be. We can say that 0 equals x squared plus 3x minus 10. We're going to replace the y with the 0. So I'm going to draw a little arrow back and forth, 0 and y. So now we want to factor our equation. Now this says left side, I have it here on the right side. Doesn't really matter which side you've put it on, as long as you are factoring out the side with the trinomial. So that means that we need to figure out what our factors are going to be for this trinomial by using that x method. I'm going to draw my x. On top, we're going to say it multiplies. On the bottom, we add. But now which number do I put where? Well, if you think back to when we multiplied our binomials, the last number, the only way that I can get this last number is by multiplying those 2 numbers together in my binomial. And the middle term I get by combining my like terms. But I don't want the x, I just want the number in front of it. So we have negative 10 and we have 3. So let's go ahead and list our factors for 10. We've got 1 and 10. 2 and 5, no 3, no 4, those are all my factors. But now I need a negative 10 when I multiply, so one of these factors is negative, I'll make it the left one. And I want it to be a positive when I add them together, so that tells me that the smaller of my factors is going to be the negative one. Now the way that I know which factor pair to pick is by testing it out, seeing which ones would add to give me 3. If I add negative 1 to 10, that will give me a positive 9, so I know that that one won't work. But negative 2 plus 5 would give me a positive 3, so I know that one's going to work. I'll use negative 2 and 5 for my factors. Now I'll have 0 equals, when I write this out as my factored set, remember we take x plus our factor, in this case it's negative 2. Negative beats out a positive, so we'd write x minus 2. Times, in parentheses, x plus our other factor. In this case, it's a positive, so we'll leave it as a positive in our parentheses. All right, so that was step 2. Step 3 says that we set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x. There we go, step 3. Set each factor equal to 0, solve for x. So I have 0 equals x minus 2, and 0 equals x plus 5. Remember that each set of parentheses is going to be one factor for my trinomial. So we've set them both equal to 0. Now we need to solve for x. So I'm going to get x by itself here. That means that I need to move this negative 2. To move a negative, I need to do its opposite. So I add 2 to both sides. And when I do that, I'll get x equals 2. Same thing, but for our other factor, I have x plus 5, and I want just x by itself. So I'm going to minus 5 by doing the opposite to get it to the other side. So now I'll have x equals negative 5. So we can now write our answers in curly brackets, or you can leave it like this. Another way to write this is to have 2, negative 5. So let's take a look at some more examples. Remember that there are lots of possibilities for these trinomials, so if you're getting frustrated with them, don't give up, always come and ask questions. So the next example I want to talk about is this number 13. And the reason why I want to talk about it is because we didn't quite get to talk about it a lot in class. For this example here, we have x squared minus 64 equals 0. And this one's different because we don't have that middle term with just x. This is actually a special type of trinomial that we would have added together or multiplied together. This trinomial is actually the product of the difference of squares. And so the way it works is whatever our factors are, the middle term gets canceled out. When something gets canceled out, that means that there are 0 of that thing. So instead we can think of this equation as x squared plus 0x minus 64 equals 0. Now that we have 3 terms, we can actually factor this trinomial. We want to multiply to get the last number, which is a negative 64. And I want them to add together to give me 0, that middle term in my expression. So now I'm going to start listing the factors of 64. We have 1 and 64, 2 and 32, 3 doesn't work, 4 and 16, 5 doesn't work, 6 won't work because 3 didn't work, and then we have 7, which doesn't work, and 8. And I know 8 works because 8 times 8 gives me 64. And that's going to be our last factor for 64, and I know that because 8 is the same as 8, so I would just be rounding myself back around through this factor set. So we figured out the things that multiply together to give me 64, but now I need to figure out which ones are going to add to give me 0. Well, as they are right now, none of these can be added together to get 0. However, I know that one of these factors has to be negative. So some of you may have already figured out the trick. I know that since this is a negative 64, and when I combine those like terms, that means that the factors have to be the same number. So that means that if I have a negative 8 and a positive 8, those added together would give me a 0. So I'll have negative 8 on the left and a positive 8 on the right. So those are my 2 factors. So now we would write x minus 8 times x plus 8 equals 0. And if we wanted to write this as just our x equals terms, we would do the next step of having x minus 8 equals 0 and an x plus 8 equals 0, splitting that up into its 2 sets. Solving for x in both of these, I would add 8 on this one. So I would get x equals a positive 8. And for this one, I have to minus 8 to both sides. So that would give me x equals a negative 8. And we can write our final answer in those curly brackets. 8, negative 8. Now, if you want to try out any of these other ones here, you certainly can. I will be uploading the key to these, so you can always double check your work with that. One final thing I wanted to talk about is what happens if I'm given an equation that's not already in standard form. I don't have all the terms on the same side. Well, simply, we need to move those terms so they are on the same side. So let's look at number 17 here first. I have x squared plus 4x equals 21. And I want this to be equal to 0. So that means I need to move this thing that's over here all by itself. Since it's a positive 21, I need to subtract 21 from both sides. Now my equation would say x squared plus 4x minus 21 equals 0. So we can factor this now. I have a middle term and I have my last term, and we're equal to 0. So let's go ahead and set up our x method. Multiply on top, add on the bottom. I need to multiply to get the last number, which is negative 21, and add them together to get a positive 4. So we'll have 1 and 21. 2 doesn't work. 3 does. It's 3 and 7. 4 doesn't work. 5 and 6 don't work, and we're back to 7. So these are the only factors for 21. If I need them to add together to give me 4, but multiply to get a negative 21, one of these factors is going to be negative, and it's going to be the smaller one. Now, some of you have probably already noticed that 3 and 7 have a difference of 4, and since one of them needs to be negative, I know that it needs to be the 3 because my 4 is positive. All right, so we've got our 2 factors. we'll take x minus 3 times x plus 7 equals 0. Set both of those factors equal to 0, so x minus 3 equals 0, x plus 7 equals 0. And really, we're just taking the opposite of what we've plugged in for our factors as our final solution. So we'll get x equals a positive 3 and x equals a negative 7 when we solve for x in both of those examples. So we'll have 3 and negative 7 as our final solution. As always, you can try out these other examples here, and I will be posting the final key for our notes page on our Schoology for today. If you have any questions, please let me know. See you later.